Android development. I'm really excited and really actually proud to see the community here in Toronto. I'm actually from Canada. I grew up in small town British Columbia. Came out here to go to university. I went to Waterloo and worked at Research in Motion about 10 years ago, and went off to a Google co-op internship after that, and kind of got into building APIs. I actually built the Google Finance API during one of my internships, and I did one other co-op term at Facebook, building the original Facebook Android SDK. And then after that, went off to grad school and did some startups, built authentication systems there, and then ended up at Google full-time working as the product manager for all of the third-party APIs that we offer. So that's things like Google Sign-In. We have a new API called SmartLock, an entire authentication solution in a box in the form of Firebase Auth. So I'll talk a little bit about that today, sort of in having looked at literally hundreds of different apps over the years and looking at what works well in terms of security and usability in apps to get people signed up and signed in. This talk is really kind of distilling down a lot of these ideas and suggestions into a couple of different things that I would hope that the developer community is able to try out and give us feedback on. If you build apps yourself, and I'd actually be curious to know, like, of all the people here today, how many are actually Android developers, like hands-on building apps every day? Any designers? Any like product people, CEOs, entrepreneurs? Okay, so I think we're mostly the tech crew here, which is good. But thinking about some of these ideas and seeing what you might be able to build in your own app, I love taking a look at what people are building. And I was even at Wattpad this morning and talking to 500 Pixels earlier, and in Toronto for a couple days. So if you'd like to chat, just get my attention afterwards. And you can always send me an email. I'm just sso@google.com. All right, so let's jump into it and maybe look at an example first. So the idea here is, you are building the next great app, maybe your own startup, something like that. And let's say it's the food app. And so someone can land on the food app, they download it, pay for an install from Facebook or something like that. And people have to get through this screen, which is authentication. And it even came up in the talks that we just had, Sumit and James talking about knowing who the user is and getting them signed in easily. And it can be pretty painful, as we take a look at here. So let's get started. And I'm going to use my friend Alex as an example. So Alex wants to use this app, and she gets started by trying to sign up. So pretty standard stuff here. You enter your email address, create a username. Maybe you have to add your name or some other information, fill out a form in order to sign up. And what I'm going to keep track of here, if you look in the corner there's a couple of ducks. And that's the number of times that you have to enter your password in order to get into this app. So you can see we're at 2 so far to sign up. And we'll see how many this ends at, but giving a little hint of what's coming. So the idea is you have to sign up. And so you enter the password there twice. And what does it say? OK, well, the first thing it always says is that an account already exists. And I'm sure everybody has seen this before. You go to sign up. You put in all of that information. You go to the trouble of creating an account. And then it tells you afterwards, well, you know what? You've already got an account. And that's understandable. We download lots of these apps. And you can't necessarily remember which one you've created an account for in the past. So let's try signing in. And Alex is just like everybody. She uses the same username password combination everywhere, which is not a good idea. As you've probably heard in the news, there's a lot of username password databases out there floating around that that's probably not great for security. But let's try the usual one. And what does it say? Well, nope. Maybe there's some special password requirements here. And she used a slightly different one. So we're going to have to try to recover at this point. And this is the flow that a lot of people would probably start to give up at this point. Like going through password resets is not the most fun, and of course it means going to your email and trying to find that message. And Alex is pretty lucky here because what happens to most people is that reset password link ends up in their spam or some folder, and they're gone at that point. So Alex is lucky that she can find this and clicks on the link there, and it says, OK, you've got to set a new password now. So we're up to 5. And then it says, OK, you're all good. Now you need to log in one more time. Getting painful. But are we done? Are we done? Well, if you look carefully, we clicked on a link in the email. We've just signed into the mobile website, and we are still not signed into the app. So let's flip back to the app one more time. We're up to 7 now, and finally logged into the food app. I hope that was worth it. So the point that I want to make here is that authentication user experience and building this type of thing is actually pretty complicated. It's probably not the first thing you think about when you're trying to design and build an app. It's probably not the thing you want to spend a lot of time on, but it is very complicated, and it was very impactful to the experience that a lot of the people who are using your app, especially the new people, have. And it's often the very first experience that it's very confusing that, I come from Google, and I could tell you, just add a Google sign-in button there, and that'll make things better. But to be completely honest, like adding Google and Facebook buttons over the last 5 years to all of these apps have not solved authentication problems. That, in fact, in some ways, it's made things worse. Now there's multiple buttons to choose from. You've had to change your UI, give up real estate on the first screen in your app to, Google and to Facebook. And then there's still all these legacy users out there, people who are still signing in with a password, who have to be helped. And there's this ongoing problem of having a sign up and a sign in UI. So in many ways, adding buttons has not actually fixed the problem. It's made things worse. And it's even more complicated then for you as developers to actually manage systems like this, build and maintain them and keep them secure. OK, so that's, I think, one of the big takeaways of this talk is that if you look at the performance of whatever authentication UI you've got in your app, it can sometimes be pretty terrible. That if you do analytics of how many people download your app, open it, and then actually successfully get signed in, when we go around and we ask developers about this, it's typically in the order of less than half of people who see that first screen end up actually signing in. Maybe it takes multiple tries. Maybe they end up getting a duplicate account, or they end up just abandoning and going away. And in any event, there's a real opportunity here to make these flows better, to make them more usable, and at the same time try to make things more secure. So here's that's the gist of this talk, is thinking about what are a few ideas out here that you could try out yourself. This is patterns that I've seen around the industry. And hopefully we get some feedback from you on what works and what doesn't work well. We love to hear about things and the patterns that are successful and do case studies and use examples in talks like this. And keeping in mind here that the principles that I talk about today are really oriented around a new install, acquiring a new user, or getting them signed in across devices. There's an entire another talk we could do around the security aspects of multiple factors in authentication, about re-authenticating a user on the same device using things like the fingerprint APIs on Android or other mechanisms, but really focusing on this case of you've got a new install, how do you get somebody signed in, signed up, and how can you maybe even make it easier on some of the things like Sumit was talking about, form factors like a watch. So the first principle that I put out there is think very carefully about when you're actually asking somebody to sign in and sign up to your service. And is it really necessary to sign up in the first place? Because these are probably the questions that are coming through people's minds as they look at the first screen of a new install. Is it, look, what is this app? Do I really want to be signing up for this and providing information? What is it all about? Is this worth my time? And so hopefully, measuring how this performs, there's a few ideas that I'll put out there to try to think about how to make things better. And so one example here is just saying a little bit about what your app does. And 500 pixels, I think, actually does a pretty good job of this. You can swipe through a few screens at the beginning, and it talks about sharing photos with the community about what this app and what this service is about and why you might actually want to try it out. OK, and then a few other ideas to think about are, is making sign up required even the right thing to do in the first place? Could you allow some sort of anonymous usage, let people search for a flight, or see what cabs are nearby before you ask them to have to create an account? And I think there's a lot of examples out there that do this well. I think the travel and the commerce industries are good examples where you can buy things, you can search for things, and then they'll ask you to create an account later. And probably more importantly, give you a good reason to create that account, to say, you can save your history, you can save your preferences, you can make all of your data available by creating an account. And I think there's some good examples out there like Flipboard that do this really well. They're all about a personalized news experience, and they really have a clear call to action when you're setting up a Flipboard account to say, hey, let's select your preferences, let's get a personalized experience for you. That's why we're asking you to create an account. So a few things to think about. I don't think there's actually a silver bullet that in all of the apps that I've looked at, there's no one pattern that works perfectly. It really depends on the nature of your app, the people who are using it, the type of industry that you're in, how you've acquired users, as to whether you should ask them to sign up front, let them do something in a signed out mode, and what incentives and what explanation you need to give them before creating an account. So my advice here is really to try a couple of different things, to experiment, and to measure how they perform. And I think you can get a lot of insight by just actually talking to your users, asking them, what do you think when you download this app? What is the experience that you've got here? And what feedback do you have for me as the developer of this app to make the experience better? So that's kind of section number one, is thinking about when to ask people to sign in. And so let's get into a couple of the mechanics then. So this first idea we kind of call an identifier first pattern. And so the idea is, these are the big problems that we can try to tackle with this. Remembering which button it was that we pressed, whether we've got an account or not, what email address to pick, and so on. And the general idea here, and this is kind of a novel concept that a few big apps like Pinterest, for example, here, if you download the Pinterest app, you'll see this. And what they've done is they've basically gotten rid of sign in and sign up. So instead of having two separate options, two copies of the UI, they just say continue with Google, with Facebook, or with your email address. And you can see what happens here is that by asking for that email address, or the same thing with a phone number, you can start to do really smart things. So you input that email address, that phone number, and there's a couple of APIs on Android that I'll mention in a second that makes this really easy. Once they select that identifier, then you can tell them, hey, tell the user, hey, you've already got an account, so you need to sign in, and let me help you by telling you how to sign in, to enter a password, to click on the Google button, to click on the Facebook button, whatever the appropriate mechanism is for this app. And for the account that you've already got. And you can look at a couple more examples here, all the ones that I previously mentioned, like Pinterest and Instacart. Eventbrite do this well, and Yumly and IM are others that we have worked with to actually implement this pattern, and seeing a lot of success, just the reduction in the amount of work that the user themselves needs to do, and the number of errors and drop-off rates that you see. So worth thinking about. It does take a little bit of work to implement a pattern like this, but it is really powerful. And so if you take this and you kind of put it in combination with a couple of other things, making sign up really easy and keeping people signed in automatically, let's see what's possible. So this is, one of the great tragedies, I think, of the mobile world, is that people have taken whatever UI they had for signing up on the web, as the desktop, where you had a full keyboard, and they've basically just ported it over to their mobile app. They've just taken that form and they've rebuilt it in mobile. And that just doesn't make sense, because on mobile, who is going to go through all of this on a mobile keyboard and hope that they get it right, typing in their address and making sure there's no typos. This is the point where people might figure out they've got other things to do. So my hope is that you can make this a bit easier too. So the first one, if you want to take a takeaway kind of thing to look up as homework here, on Android we added something to the Play Services SDK called a hint request. And it looks like this. You can basically show a list of the email addresses with names and pictures of any accounts on the device, and you can do this without a Android permission. So instead of asking for the get accounts permission, as developers may have done in the past to build an autocomplete UI, you can actually invoke this Android Play Services API, get an intent back, and then when you fire this intent, you have a picker, you'll get called back with the information the user selects. And you can basically fill a sign-up form in this way. So for examples of this, look at Flipboard, AliExpress. There's an app in Germany called Komoot that did this. They ran this as an experiment, an A/B test, manually entering the form versus having a picker, and they saw 20% higher completion of these flows. So that's a nice addition you can do as an Android developer, probably worth the afternoon's work to get that into the app. And we're seeing some pretty good numbers there. If you check out the link, you can see some examples. So the next kind of general category of making sign up easier is to defer asking for information until you really need it. And so we've all had this experience where you click one of those buttons like Google or Facebook, and it will ask you for a whole list of things, your friends and your date of birth and your blood type, everything like that, before they'll allow you to sign up. And I think that there's some good examples out there. Like I mentioned, I was just at Wattpad this morning, and they do this really well, that in context, at the time you need to share something or build a feed, they'll ask, hey, would you like to connect so that we can see who your friends are and help you build relevant suggestions, build the relevant content. And in the context of doing this, it's much more likely that someone will actually grant that access when they understand what this information is being used for, rather than abandoning up front and maybe going with an email and password sign up that might be more difficult, or figuring they'll try some other service instead. So that's an interesting one. We call this incremental authorization, so asking for authorization to additional data incrementally as opposed to upfront when you're authenticating the user. Okay, and then the last couple here around making sign up easier. I have a screenshot here of mobile web, just because a lot of app developers out there are doing new user registrations on mobile web, where you might encounter this user for the first time. And there's a couple of really easy things you can do. So for example, on mobile web, you can annotate the form fields with things like email or name, so that autocomplete kicks in, even if you don't have the native picker available. And there's a couple of nice patterns here. So if you search for things like why the password confirmation field must die, and whether you should show passwords in plain text when people are creating them or not, that there's actually a lot of really good UX studies around what the performance of apps are when you actually let people see the password they're creating. And then, of course, you can hide it when they focus on the next element to maintain that security and privacy aspect. But you can make things a lot easier by not having somebody enter a repeated masked field like the password. And the same thing for email addresses, trying to avoid having to repeat entry of that on a mobile keyboard. And the last idea in this category is, I think, a new and kind of emerging one, and I'll talk about it a little bit more towards the end. And that is this idea of actually deferring password creation, not having a user set a password up front. That in reality, many people will just forget this password. They'll use a really weak throwaway password that's easy to type, something like that. And that's probably not a situation that you want to put the user in, because then that will be a reused password that could potentially be exploited in the case of a lost password database. And so the idea here is, you can actually have somebody sign up with just their email address. Verify it is a good recommendation, whether you do deferred password creation or not. But the idea is that by allowing somebody to sign up without a password, you can get more people in the door. You can send them an email that says, hey, if you'd like to set your own password, you can do it later. And in fact, if you use this in combination with that first suggestion about identifier first, when someone comes back and you get their email address, you can even give them a hint that says, you don't have a password yet, check your email to set one if you need to. And the Zillow app, which is a real estate app in the US, does this perfectly. If you take a look at Zillow, you can see how it works. Okay, so the next kind of trick here is, well, once you've got somebody signed up, let's keep them signed in and not let them have to go through that experience again. And the main ideas here are that you can use a couple of nice APIs on Android. Not just the Google ones here, like Smart Lock that I mentioned, which basically lets you retrieve people's saved passwords from Chrome, from previous saves in the Android app, and sign them in automatically. But in fact, you can use the Facebook and a few other of the identity SDKs out there to do things like automatic sign-in across devices. So if you can sign somebody in automatically, just keep them signed in. That's probably the easiest thing you can do. Re-engage them across devices. If they signed up a year ago and they've got a new phone now, don't let them get into a situation where they have to struggle to get signed back in. And lots of good examples there, also in the Smart Lock category, at least for the Google APIs. Okay, so in the next kind of general area, once you've got somebody who's trying to sign in, if you can't sign them in automatically, at least do this identifier first pattern and let them know, as I alluded to, how Zillow does it, of telling the person, either you don't have a password, you do have a password and you need to sign in, you need to sign up, or you clicked one of those buttons, and just do the work of telling somebody, what action they need to take, rather than, passing the burden onto them to figure out how to get signed into this app. And the last kind of general category I'd kind of call out here around keeping people signed in is to manage session state. And James was even talking about this earlier. There's the OAuth protocols for managing tokens that can be used to access authenticated resources. And James was talking about accessing resources for other services. But of course, you can use the same model of maintaining OAuth 2 refresh and access tokens to access your own backend service. Hopefully you do something like that. In general, apps have pretty good session management. It's rare that you'll see people signed out after using an app unless it's been a really long time. But certainly on the web, this is still a big problem that people issue very short-lived cookies for security reasons, especially before they've migrated to an HTTPS environment. And in that world, people are often coming back to the service and realizing that they've been logged out. So if you can do it, keep people signed in. That will prevent a lot of these problems in the first place. All right, so the next category here is what we call account linking. And the general idea here is that there are many ways in which someone could end up with a duplicate account. So not only do they have trouble signing in, signing up, but once they come back, if they can't quite remember how they signed in last time, it's very easy to end up with another account and having a previous account with all of its data abandoned. So what can we do to prevent that? So the first is, once you've got that identifier I was talking about, hey, check in your user database, like, does this account already exist? Maybe they used a different authentication mechanism, but just let this user know if they've got an existing account. And so the most common scenarios where you might see this is if you've had username password for a long time and you add a Google button, someone could come along, click the Google button, and make sure to let them into that account that already exists. In the case of Google, as I'll mention here in a second, you can sign people in automatically, but in the case of something like Facebook, you'll have to ask them to confirm that they own the previous account. And the reason for that is that Google is actually an authoritative source for the email address, that if you see a Gmail address, we can tell you for sure that the owner of that Gmail address is present. You can let that user in. But Facebook is not authoritative for email addresses. All that you know is that this person at one point owned the email address associated with that Facebook account. So you do have to be a little bit careful there. There's kind of an edge case in terms of security. And so you can see like Orbitz does this nicely, where if you log in with Facebook, they'll tell you, hey, you've got to make sure to prove that you own this account before linking them together. But don't let them create a duplicate account. And the same thing here around Facebook and Google worth calling out is that there's another identifier in either of these flows that we call it the subject field in any of the tokens that Google issues. And it's that when you have a Google or a Facebook user, there's a Google or a Facebook ID. And make sure to keep track of that, because what often happens in some of these weird edge cases is that someone will change their Google account or their Facebook email address. They'll click that button again when they come back, and then you've ended up in a duplicate account because their email address or their phone number or whatever you used has changed, whereas you could have kept track of what the Google or the Facebook identifier is. So this is kind of an edge case that is worth thinking about, but it does come up when we talk to developers about the support cases that they see. This is an interesting one. So my big kind of takeaway and the most important thing that I think you can get out of this talk today, besides doing measurement and realizing that there's a problem, that it's about trying to avoid having to build these type of systems yourself. And I'll get into this diagram in a second to explain kind of where it comes from. But the big areas we see these days around developers getting in trouble is things like this: having a username and password database, to have and a lot of users, and build a system where as a developer or a startup, security may not be your forte, that you may not have an on-staff team to make your username, password, database infrastructure as secure as possible and always up to date. And so what we see happen literally every week, you can look in the news, you can probably look in the news today, and somebody's username password database has been stolen. Maybe and hopefully it's the hashed passwords. But really, if you're the dedicated bad guys who know how to get into these systems, reversing password hashes is pretty easy. You can use these tricks like rainbow tables to reverse the hashes very quickly. So hopefully you're adding things like salts in there too to make username and password databases more secure. But this really illustrates the problem, that it actually takes a lot of work to build a secure backend system. And so what we've seen is there's a few interesting developers out there. So this is a screenshot from Medium. And another big one that is in this category is Slack, where they've basically said, hey, we are not going to get into the business of handling users' passwords. Every time you sign into something like Medium, they say, okay, we got your email address. We use that pattern of asking for the email address first, and we just sent you an email. You need to click on the email. You need to verify that you actually own that email address in order to get signed in. And so we see this kind of emerging trend of going passwordless. And I'd be really interested to see like how many people end up implementing that, and that there are tools out there that allow you to do this pretty easily. So let's look at the next suggestion here, which is if you have somebody showing up here who has something like a Gmail address, you can actually outsource this authentication to Google, that as a provider of Google identities of Gmail addresses, you can just go off to Google and say, hey, Google, I've got so-and-so at gmail.com. Can you help me authenticate this user? Can you give me a token from the Google sign-in APIs, for example, that says this user is actually present? And there's an interesting piece here that I didn't put in the slides because it's kind of the secret sauce. But I was talking to Mark about this, and that what happens when somebody authenticates to Google as a Gmail user? And there's a really interesting and sophisticated set of checks that we do on our side to make sure that this user is who they say they are. That we aren't simply accepting Gmail username and passwords anymore. We, in fact, use multiple signals, hundreds of signals, in fact, looking at where this authentication event is happening when we're setting up a device, looking at the history of a browser, doing really sophisticated stuffs around even checking mouse movements, typing speeds to check for bots, keep the bad guys out. And so all of these inputs are basically put into a machine-learned algorithm that classifies how risky, how likely it is that someone who's trying to sign in with a Gmail account or a Google account is actually who they say they are. And so you can really leverage this by having people sign in with Google. We'll give you back a token in place of having your user input their own username and password. And you can take that token from Google. It's signed with our private key. You check it against a set of public keys. And then you can know that this assertion, as we call it, came from Google, that we have done all of those sophisticated checks of determining that this is actually the Gmail user who they claim to be. And you can just rely on Google. You can get out of the password business. So this is one idea, going to authoritative identity providers, as we say, like Google or Microsoft for the Hotmail accounts and others, and really avoid being in the password business. And so to actually implement this type of stuff yourself, I would recommend going to what we say the professionals, leaving it to somebody like Google or Microsoft, and there's a whole bunch of other vendors here too. I'll use Firebase as an example here in a second, but basically you can take an off-the-shelf identity system that has a lot of these best practices, that manages a user database for you, and even avoids having to have users authenticate with passwords in the first place by going to some of these vendors. And so just to illustrate and kind of make this concrete, I think we've got time for an example. So let me walk through how this works with Firebase. So the ideas here are that you build a sign-in system. It looks like this. It asks for the username and the password. I think it's a little hard to see there, but you start with that. So that's a pretty simple place to begin. But as I talked about today, you can do something clever when you add the sign up functionality by asking for the email address first, steering the user into the right flow. But as I just alluded to, you shouldn't really be in the password business if you don't need to be. Like, we're going to have to deal with all these forgotten passwords. You probably really want to add those libraries from Google to authenticate a user with a token, asserting their identity, so adding something like Google sign-in. These days, I think you might have to add a couple of different providers of identity. The Facebook button is probably the next one that you'll have in the list there. And so you can see it's starting to get a little bit complicated. There's a lot of different flows that people could end up going through. And you'll end up in this situation where you might have to link those accounts together to say, you've already got an account, but now you've signed in with Google or with Facebook. And so it starts to sort of get complicated. And then on top of that, there's all of these tricks of adding things like assistive dialogues to fill in the email field, to remember which provider the user used, or to remember their password, automatically sign them in next time. And you can see that this turns out to be a fair bit of work, like probably more than you'd want to spend in an afternoon, let alone have to do a couple of different times for all of the other platforms that you maintain, web and iOS. And then keep it up to date as you make changes to any of your UI in the future. So that's kind of the rationale behind going for a service like Firebase, where instead of having to implement all of this logic on every platform and taking thousands of lines of code and a lot of time out of the cycles that you've got for development, you can go to a platform like Firebase, just drop in one of our SDKs, and it will give you the UI, it'll give you the backend service, and you can probably get started with that in a day or so. So that's kind of the main thing that our team builds and offers is we've thought about how to implement all of these ideas, and we've kind of built an entire UI and an example implementation. You can take it and customize it. It's actually open source. The links are there if you want to check it out. And there's a web version that we should be open sourcing pretty soon, hopefully in the next week or two. So this launched at I/O this year, the concept of Firebase authentication, revamped from what you might have seen in the past from Firebase tools, and added with UI on top of it. So hopefully that's kind of an example of one of the useful libraries that are out there to implement a lot of the suggestions that I talked about today. And you can take it at home and try it yourself, see all of the different flows implemented in the open source libraries. You can use the backend service that manages all of the user's credentials for you, and it will work on any platform with a variety of different SDKs for different library languages. So lastly, I'd like to close by just saying that these are a couple of things that you could try, and at the end of the day, I hope that it makes the apps and the services that are on Android easier to use. And I think that's really the key interest that Google has in offering these APIs, which are all free, is that when someone downloads an app and goes to the time to installing and using up some of their data and accepting the permissions, or ends up on one of your websites through search or through a link that someone shared with them, at the end of the day, I hope that they actually find and are able to use the service that they were looking for, get the information that they needed. Because it's really a tragedy, and I think part of the fault on our side at both Google and as app developers, that people will try these apps, they'll get stuck at some point where they can't sign in, can't sign up, and they'll abandon. And I think that's really a shame to see someone click through on a result and bounce back or uninstall an app that they've just acquired. So with that, I can maybe take a few questions if we've got time. But if you're interested, you can always send me an email. I'm just sso@google.com. These are the products that my team works on, so the ones that I'm kind of expert on. But I would love to just generally chat about some of the ideas talked about today, and also just see what your feedback is on these ideas and how they perform. And you're always welcome to play around with the open source code, take a look at the other offerings that are out there, and see if you have things that you'd love to see added to this talk. I'd love to have your app as an example.